Welcome to Falling Flat. Can VR be funny? This is obviously a question of existential importance compared to trivial matters like nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula or the NRA's stranglehold on the American population. So thank you for making time to show up and talk about this important question. Before I introduce our panelists, please allow me to just set the stage for why we're discussing this and what we're discussing. This new medium of virtual reality, and by that we mean everything from 360 video to virtual reality and also augmented reality, has always been expected to create higher levels of immersion into content, and through that, higher levels of engagement with that content and ultimately empathy. And there's numerous academic studies out there by now that make that point and confirm that this theory is indeed correct. So Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab, that team has conclusively proven that virtual reality content compared to traditional media achieves higher levels of empathy. And this empathy creation is so strong that VR has actually become known as the ultimate empathy machine. And that's great. There's plenty of examples out there. You want to know, for example, what it's like being a frightened, hungry, and very wet refugee crossing the Mediterranean? Well, there is a VR experience for that. Or you want to experience what it's like to be a tree and have your limbs cut off by a chainsaw? There's a VR experience for that as well. We've seen countless of these examples that feature VR as the ultimate empathy machine. We've also seen that NGOs are using VR as a very effective tool to fundraise based on this empathy creation capability of virtual reality. But we've seen comparatively little when it comes to VR as a medium for comedy. So what we mean by comedy is in VR is not the awkward stock photos of weird people using VR headsets and looking goofy. Some of these can be pretty funny, but what we actually mean are custom-built VR games, 360 videos, other VR experiences as a way to make people laugh unashamedly through VR. So why is there so much empathy and so little laughter in virtual reality? Why is there so much drama and so little comedy in VR? What has held VR back from being as powerful a medium for comedy as it has become for empathy and drama? We're going to explore this. My name is Johannes Larcher. I'm the CEO of Sxsw, an Austin-based company in the VR space. We are a studio that creates a ton of VR content, mainly on behalf of large brands like Ford, Walmart, Estee Lauder, and others. We've also dabbled in VR and comedy. We recently produced our first comedy short film called Oh Shit. It's a short movie that describes the adventures of a piece of dog poop on the streets of Austin. So to explore the questions before us today, we've assembled a great panel of experts in the comedy and VR spaces, and I'm going to introduce those next. So we're thrilled to have with us Sxsw Weiss.
Hi, hello.
Forgive me for reading your bio off a cue card here.
Do it.
But Sxsw is a games industry generalist, consultant, and a sociologist residing here in Austin, Texas. A 10-year games industry veteran, she has worked on multiple VR titles, including Alchemy Labs' multi-platform game Job Simulator, Vacation Simulator, and Rick and Morty. She is currently Alchemy Labs' multi-hat-wearing studio director, also known as the Owlmancer. And just in terms of context, Alchemy was acquired by Google in 2017. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Alchemy?
Sure. So Alchemy Labs basically focuses on making absurd and highly polished VR games. We're multi-platform. We like room scale, 6DoF, head and hands tracked VR. And we specifically focus on basically hand interactions and as much apparently breaking things. That's actually true. We focus on basically throwing things, playing with things, and making really compelling worlds that are tactilely interesting and a lot of humor. Jokes.
Awesome. Jokes. To her left is Neil Parris. Neil Parris is the VR and AR entertainment partnerships lead at Google. He works at the intersection of entertainment and technology, and for 13 years plus, he's been developing, pitching, and producing content in all kinds of forms across multiple platforms. Neil, maybe a little bit about what you and the Daydream team and other parts of Google are doing in VR.
Yes, so I'm based down in LA, like Johannes said, kind of at the intersection of entertainment and technology, and our team's focus is really on creating very compelling and scalable VR video content. Utilizing big IP from media partners and entertainment partners, experimenting in new forms of narrative, and leveraging kind of the best of YouTube's ability to reach large audiences to create scale.
Awesome. To my right is Griffin Gmelich. Griffin is a former colleague of mine from Hulu. He is now the SVP of Business Strategy and Distribution at the Nacelle Company and Comedy Dynamics. If you don't know these companies, they are one of the largest independent producers and distributors of comedic television, film, and stand-up comedy. They've developed and produced and distributed content on platforms including Netflix, HBO, Discovery, Amazon, A&E, and Hulu, and more. Griffin, a little bit maybe about Nacelle and Comedy Dynamics.
Sure. Nacelle is it started off as a large production house. We do not just stand-up comedy. We do series as well, and we actually distribute films. The Nacelle Company came out of the need for a company to capture and be a leader in the stand-up space. We started with HBO doing 1 or 2. Now we do 65 stand-up specials a year. In relation to VR, we know that that's where the industry's heading, so we started as kind of a basis to film in VR to make sure that we started to capture A, our content, but B, look at some of how the narrative edge or how the product is going to need to develop in the future.
Awesome. So we got a great panel. We got 2 people here who primarily spent their time on filmed entertainment, 360 video, and with Sai, someone who is in the interactive VR sector. So maybe, Sai, we start with you and maybe a little bit more about Job Simulator. Many people know it. Some people in the audience may not know it. What is it when you first set out to it? Was the goal to create a funny VR game, and what was hard about that?
Yeah, sure. So Job Simulator, basically for those of you who haven't played, has anyone here played Job Simulator, by the way? Oh, look, humans have played it. Hello, welcome. So basically, Job Simulator, for those who haven't played it, the year's 2050, robots have taken over all human jobs. And they've basically, with all the spare time humans have, the robots decided they need something to do. So the robots created the Job Simulator that allows humans to go basically into this museum environment to see what it was like to job back in the heyday of humans doing jobs. But the robots kind of did a brief scan of Wikipedia to sort of see what these jobs were. So we have things like an auto mechanic, a convenience store clerk, a gourmet chef, and an office worker. But it's a sort of thing where they get everything wrong. So like, for example, in the office worker, one of the first things the robots tell you to do is like, oh, it's very important to eat your donut. That was a crucial part of jobbing. You know, oh, we better check your email. Quick, delete it all. That was the point of email, was to get to inbox 0. So just go ahead and delete it. And so it's just a lot of these sort of misinterpretations of what jobs were at the time. In terms of creating it, it was funny at the time that we created Job Simulator, there were actually no VR games yet because commercial VR hadn't been launched. We had this, weird prototype that Valve gave us that was basically literally hot glued together, like 3D printed and hot glued, and if you touched it in the wrong place, it would shock you. It was that kind of prototype. And there were no games for it, so we kind of went into VR sort of seeing where is the fun. Like, that was our point. We had been making multi-platform games on PC and mobile for many years, also humor, jokes-based games. But VR was brand new, so we needed to see what was cool about this medium that made it fun and interactive. So basically, we just started building stuff. And then as we built stuff, we just started building more and more stuff. We found that physics was fun and interesting, and then we just put in more stuff. And then we found that a lot of humor came in sort of having physics objects and letting people like kind of run wild with it and inviting people to play with these objects. And they found their fun, and they found comedy in playing with these fake things that felt real. And so that's sort of how Job Simulator came about.
And then there was the next one, Which,
Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty.
Right, so then we went on to Rick and Morty Virtual Recality, because everything has to have weird names and hilariousness. So Rick and Morty was a collaboration that we did with Adult Swim Games, and this was sort of just a beautiful like merger where we had done a lot of these like interactions in Job Simulator, and then the idea of being able to jump into Rick's garage from the television show was something that everyone sort of wanted to experience, and there was a lot of fun to be had. But the cool thing with this is that we got to add the component of like a really rich narrative. A lot of the voice acting of Justin Roiland, the storytelling is hilarious, the world is outrageous, so we were able to combine the physical comedy of like inviting people to come and play and be a participant and physically have fun and tell jokes with the ability to write narrative and also have jokes through writing. So that was our evolution.
And in both those games, was there a moment or were there situations where you felt that VR, being in VR, made it particularly challenging to create the comedic effect you were looking for?
No, because we'd been writing comedy games for a while, and VR was a different medium, so we approached it as a different medium, but we were always going to do comedy. We were always going to do jokes and comedy. VR itself offered sort of a new opportunity to investigate like new forms of comedy, things like it's not just us presenting to a player, we're inviting the player to come and partake, right? They become a member of your game, right? They are having this experience. They are a central character to it. So it took a different form in that now we're sort of thinking about inviting the player and almost depending on them in some ways to help us with the comedy. They're going to find the jokes by, for example, in Job Simulator, we have this one thing where we have a clock on the wall in the cubicle. And if you grab the clock, you can pull it off the wall. This is already something that people don't really expect in games because they're used to games where like, oh, that's just a part of the wall, you can't pull that off. But you could pull that off, and that's exciting and gives them a little thrill of like, oh, I can actually pull that off. And then they flip over to the other side and it has a pun that says, I can't believe you took the time to read this. And it really involves the player coming in and activating the comedy and sort of subverting their expectations of what they expect to see in VR.
Very, very cool. So at Google, Neil, you obviously invest in a lot of 360 video content in all kinds of genres, from sports to music to social media stars, but also comedy. Last year, I believe you did, jointly with Felix and Paul, a series called The Confessional with stars like Trevor Noah and Judd Apatow and Howie Mandel. Talk to us a little bit about how that played out, why you picked that particular show, what the challenges were in creating it, how it worked out for you, positive or not. Would love to learn a bit more about that.
Yeah, it wasn't a project that I worked on specifically, but I can speak to it from my colleagues. So Felix and Paul brought us an opportunity to partner with Just for Laughs at their comedy festival in Montreal. They had access to a lot of big talent that would be on site that was interested in exploring VR technology. And we were basically playing out the thesis that if you can put yourself in a really intimate situation with comedians, really be immersed and feel like you're in the same space with them, essentially in a confessional, where they're telling you stories that you wouldn't otherwise hear, that would really kind of pop the comedy and make you feel like you were a part of something special. I think, we found some learnings from it. I think half the episodes really worked, and like Lily Singh, for example, told amazing stories and really was engaging. And some others we found that, the stories themselves maybe weren't the right fit for the setting. And so one of the learnings that Felix and Paul and our teams took from that is make the experience and the space kind of more engaging and more filling. So it's not just about the intimacy, but like what's going on behind you. In the confessional, there wasn't anything going on behind you, but when we made I Love Dogs, which is a short stop motion animation based on the Wes Anderson movie that just came out, we had a whole series of things going on behind you. So if you looked around behind you, you would see like the animatronics and the people making the series. And so it just gives you things to discover and explore as you're watching. And each time you go back to it, you probably find something else.
Very cool. So do you think that when I watched The Confessional, some of it was very, very good, but in other situations I had the feeling that VR didn't really add much to the effect because, as you said, the action was all in front of you, right in the confessional. Nothing was going on around you. Would you have been better off doing that as a regular, standard, linear 2D video series?
I think for some of the episodes, yeah. And then, I think, again, like this whole medium right now is still in a very experimental phase. None of us have the answers. Our hypothesis was that the intimacy would create a lot of humor, and it did in some cases and did in others. And so it's really about trying and testing and learning. And I don't think that iconic piece of VR video comedy content has been created yet. And that's what's exciting, to be able to kind of help push that forward.
Yeah, comedy is very, very hard, and maybe a topic we can get back to in a little bit is whether VR actually makes it even harder to be funny.
Yeah.
Griffin, you guys produce a ton of comedy content and distribute it in all kinds of platforms. Most of that is in traditional 2D video, but I know that you've started experimenting and playing around with, especially in the stand-up comedy space, with taping performances in VR, and I think you're also working on some original VR content. What's driving that interest, and what has worked for you so far, and where have you found it to be challenging?
Well, I can tell you what drove the interest. Actually, it was CEO driven. Our CEO did it because when we started releasing product as a distributor just a couple years ago, companies like DirecTV came to us and said, what do you have in 4K? And we hadn't really done anything in 4K. And we looked at the next big wave coming as VR, and we said, we need to get ahead of this. We need to make sure that our catalog isn't stagnant, that we have something that's going to be valuable in the future. So we started experimenting with VR because we thought we had missed a wave on a prior technology. To that end, we're filming almost everything we can in VR, and we don't have the experience down just yet, but what we do have is we have all the content that we need.
So Neil, I remember when we worked together on our series, Austin City Limits Backstage, one of the comments from the outset was just taking a VR camera, a 360 camera into a live environment and pointing it at the stage and the audience, that's not enough. There's got to be a better reason to actually invest in creating that content in 360. How does that apply to maybe stand-up comedy, right? Some of the content I saw from you is single camera in the room, you get a view of the audience, you get a view of the stage. Is that good enough? Does that really add to the experience?
Was that a question for me or Neil?
Yes, question for you and for you.
You start.
So oddly, I had a brief discussion prior to coming out here, and I would tell you that when I look at VR as a format, I look at VR much like on a historical way, how we went from black and white to color, or from silent films to talking films. And I think we're kind of at the cusp of that, right at the beginning, into understanding how the narrative helps shape, how the technology helps shape the narrative. And I would say that we haven't captured it yet because we haven't figured out the right way for the interaction. Earlier today when we were talking, the idea would be that if we had a comedian that perhaps did a lot of crowd work, where the crowd became part of the actual piece rather than just a single camera on one storyteller, you make it about the audience, you make it about the room, or you make it about the event. We haven't actually captured that yet, but in an intellectual or thoughtful way, that's probably the way that it's going to be most of the public, where they can see that interaction and they can feel like they're part of the group rather than someone just speaking with them.
Yeah, and we've stayed away so far from just filming stand-up comedy because of the we don't know what the format is that actually enhances it in VR. So it was definitely very interested to hear a riff that you had on what we see as some of the limitations.
So you mentioned something here, Griffin, that's interesting. A lot of comedy happens in a social environment where you are with friends, you are with an audience in a club seeing stand-up comedy, and part of the fun is the interaction and the reaction to the joke. VR tends to be socially quite isolating, right? You're on a headset, you're removed from the world, you're completely immersed. Is that part of the reason that we're not seeing more VR content, comedy content being produced? Does that make it extra hard to do comedy well in VR?
Okay, well, I'm gonna go. So the thing is that at least with interactive VR experiences, we find that they're not actually quite that isolating. We actually find that a lot of VR parties sort of spring up around the experience of someone's in VR and a crowd of people will come up around and start shouting and be like, oh my God, what's that? And pick that up, and what's that over here? And you should try this. And like it sort of becomes a bit of a collaborative experience. I think that's sort of the nature of interactive VR experiences that sort of allows and affords for that because you're not passive, because you're engaging, it invites people to come in and sort of look at it and experience it with you. They want to know what you're doing, and they want to know what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, and it kind of adds to the humor in that particular way. So I just didn't answer your question, is basically
No,
what
you
I
did.
just
I think
did.
it's different if you are in a gaming environment,
Right.
an interactive environment, rather than a video environment.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, which is why I wonder for you two who have done more passive experiences, have you thought about integrating some interactive, like maybe considered involving some interactive experiences to help sort of maybe include that sort of feeling of more social engagement?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, right now a lot of our VR videos focused on, distribution on YouTube, and there isn't the high level of interactivity right now built into the platform. So while we want to explore it, we're kind of waiting for the platform to catch up to that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right, and when Griffin, you're very open in saying that we haven't figured it out yet, and I think that holds for many, many parts of the VR and AR sector. But what are the angles you're going to try and pursue here to make it even more compelling in terms of audience experience watching stand-up comedy in VR? What would you like to experiment with?
Well, I think the key portion for us is that we need to find a way to make the audience more important, or where the audience is collaborative with the actual event. So right now, the limitation that we have is that you usually get a storyteller. Let's say Tiffany Haddish, who's on the screen right now. Tiffany will come up and she'll have a rehearsed act that she does for 50 or 60 minutes. And the only interaction that you get from the VR is looking, as you turn left, right, or behind you, is seeing whether or not how the audience is reacting. In the event that you have comedians, and some comedians are very good, like with someone like a Seinfeld or a Doug Stanhope, where they call it crowd work, where you come in. It's almost like a host will do this at the beginning of several people. They'll go ahead, the crowd, they say, where are you in from? What do you do? Or that's the worst hat. And all of a sudden, you have a whole bunch of interaction from the crowd, and that will cause perhaps the VR experience where someone now wants to interact and see what the hell does that hat look like, or that person from Philadelphia wears the worst clothes in the world, or whatever it might be. I think that's part of it, and then there's also perhaps a physical element to it, where you can invite the crowd to ask comments or questions, or you can ask them to perhaps heckle by throwing them a mic or throwing them the ball, which gives them the opportunity to speak or have their words, and that allows that interaction to help happen. We haven't quite figured that out yet, and one of the things that's still odd about us, we're filming in VR, but we haven't necessarily invested in it as the actual medium. We're doing that in conjunction with what we're doing for HBO or Netflix. We're using their money to go ahead and get our content filmed in a unique medium, but we might not be serving that medium correctly yet. We're going to have to make that shift to actually serve the medium.
Are you working on original scripted VR ideas, or is that the next step beyond just quote unquote just taping a stand-up comedy?
We do have a development group, and they are working on a couple of things, and they're primarily shorts for more proof of concept for us. But the feedback that we're going to have to greenlight or develop is going to come with how we partner with a platform or someone that's going to go ahead and push it for the VR sake, not for the necessarily the comedian's sake. When we have to be able to help with that narrative, and we actually have to be collaborative and listen to the feedback we hear from that partner. Our first ever stand-up comedy was a single camera. Now we use up to 8. We use up to 8 because that's what HBO wanted, right? You have the large crane that swings back and forth, you have audience work, you have different angles and things of that nature. Those things are going to, as we experiment and as we produce more and more in VR, our experiences are going to change, and the way that we handle it is going to change. That narrative is ultimately going to change. And I think that the narrative is important to include the audience, because that's where you'll see the most use or the most effectiveness right now, when you can bring the actual opportunity. If you're in a smoky, dingy whiskey bar, you want it to feel, or you want to know that you're in a smoky, dingy whiskey bar. If you're sitting in a South Beach location, you want to see what the people from South Beach are wearing. You want to know what their opinions are, and you want to see that they're drinking a daiquiri or whatever it might be. But right now, that what we're doing isn't necessarily capturing that, but that's kind of our wave too.
Yeah. So staying with 360 video just for a little bit longer, we talked about the user experience, consumption experience being social in many cases for comedy. Another challenge that exists in 360 video is that obviously the freedom of looking anywhere within the 360 degrees. And in comedy in particular, in scripted comedy, directing the viewer's attention to a particular point of view is critical. So does that pose an additional challenge? And you kind of encountered that in the confessional, and you solved it by having a very fixed frame in front of you, which represents the confessional. Is that a particular challenge in comedy that makes it even harder to do this well?
Yeah,
Neil?
for sure. It's definitely a challenge. I think, like all comedy, writing is key, timing is key, story is key, and that all is made somewhat more complex when you have more space around you to tell the story. So I think, we're looking at some of the perceived disadvantages of the 360 as our advantages. So while you can use the dialogue to still capture the timing and the joke, you may not be looking where where the director wants you to look. But what if you see like a little Easter egg or a nugget that helps kind of tell a different part of the story? And so we see it as kind of layers that you can kind of unpeel as you go deeper. And if you keep it super short form, which is what we're focused on right now, because it's just hard to keep someone's attention in headset for multiple minutes. Super short form allows you to kind of go back and rediscover and have a different point of view and find new things in the comedy, and I think that's what we're playing with.
Mm-hmm. Si, I'm wondering the difference between Job Simulator and also Vacation Simulator, which you're about to release next week at GDC, and then Rick and Morty, Virtual Reality. The first two are original content generated by yourself. Rick and Morty obviously builds off existing IP that lives in various formats, including animation. What was the difference working on those different buckets of content? Was it harder to work with something that pre-existed, where your degrees of freedom more limited, or was it actually a positive in terms of creating the comedic effect that you were after?
So this is actually a really interesting question. We're such a playful, collaborative studio. It was just sort of, we collaborated and played in different ways, if that makes sense. So whereas in one, like in Rick and Morty, yes, there was an established world and IP and voices and characters, and we knew them. They were quite. Justin Roiland creates and Dan Harmon creates very compelling characters that have definitely their own voice, but they're still really fun to play with, and we were able to be playful with them. And so a lot of our stuff was sort of thinking about that world and sort of thinking about more things that should exist in that world. We had a lot of leeway and a lot of support from the team, but we were allowed to go pretty far. We did all of the writing for the game in-house, and so the story is, we wrote that and then worked collaboratively with the Adults from Games team and Justin Roiland to sort of like turn that into the Rick and Morty experience. With Job Simulator and Vacation Simulator, yes, that's our original IP, and so it is very much our humor, so we get to sort of play in our own realm, in our own brains, and we like to play a lot with discovery and joy, and like I said, subverting expectations within the world itself. So a lot of it is writing, but it's also within the world and how the world itself reacts. And so that, I don't know, it was similar in terms of our playful collaborativeness, but sort of our focus towards, again, Rick and Morty was very narrative, whereas we played a lot with the world in our own IPs.
So on this panel, I'm wondering, is it fair to say that there's a disproportionately limited or small amount of comedy being created in VR? If you compare it to all the other content being created, is it fair to say that we're seeing too little?
I would say yes.
And in games as well, sorry.
We're trying to solve that by building out partnerships with kind of best-in-class animation studios. For example, we haven't announced it yet, but we're going to be building like an anthology series that takes a lot of small swings, you know, at trying to find something that breaks through, and then if one of those, you know, short episodes works, then we'll do a lot more with that animation series. We're also working with big media companies to try to take their IP that works well on TV and see what is the VR extension that tells a comedic story that leverages the best of the platform.
I guess my answer is there enough joy and humor in the world? Especially in terms of games, right? So in games, there's a lot of focus on like, you know, gritty realism and intense experiences in all games. And as we got into VR, especially in VR gaming, people are sort of taking these paradigms of, you know, games, right? Which is they're thinking, oh, now I make VR games, so I should look at games and what games did, and sort of make those, but in VR. And so a lot of times that sort of maintains that paradigm of the gritty realism and intense experience. Now it's an intense experience, but now it's glued to your face and it's more intense. There are still quite a few like incredibly funny VR experiences in VR, and I think people are starting to play because VR gives you access to the wide gamut of experiences you can have. I think people are now starting to look a little bit more at like humor and satire and joy and discovery and fun and all of that, and sort of investigating that. But I could always use more. I mean, that's why I make the games I do.
So how do we draw more talented comedy writers into VR and gaming? So Paul Scheer, a comedian, in a recent interview with Rolling Stone, pointed out, when asked why there aren't more funny games out there, there's not enough funny comedy writers who write for the gaming industry. How do we, besides yourself, how do we get more talented and more interested and intriguing comedy writers to write for games?
Oh man, so this is interesting because I don't write, and my studio doesn't write in a vacuum, right? It's not like we look for a writer who is funny, and then they write the game for us and put all the jokes in. We're so collaborative, and again, like we're always working together all the time. Our jokes become funnier because we tell each other the jokes, and then we riff on each other's jokes, and then we coalesce them into these amazing, hilarious peak form. The highest platonic ideal of the joke becomes the joke because we're all working on it together.
Like a TV writer's room a little bit.
Yeah, it is. We actually do writers' rooms quite a bit where we go into, and it is us in there for just riffing off of each other for a long time.
And eating unhealthy food, maybe.
Sometimes unhealthy food. Sometimes I bring a salad.
Oh, nice.
You know, just to sort of keep my brain working. But it is. It's. I think the idea of like a writer who is good or a writer who is funny, I think we do better in groups. I think we work together, and then like we try a joke and we see if our friends laugh, and then they don't laugh, and we're like, oh, that was terrible. But what if it was slightly different, and now there's more laughter? Okay, and then you sort of like you're able to drill down and find the funny. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I think we're also trying to, right now it's not going to be a profit center for anybody, right? So we're trying to find ways that are appealing for writers to try to break a new format and become, like I said earlier, kind of create the iconic piece of comedy VR video. And so we're giving writers a lot of chances to create short form content that could also be kind of an incubator or a pilot for something that lives off of VR. And I think that's interesting to writers as well.
Yeah, I think the platforms play a big role in the answer to all that, right? So the hardware platforms from Oculus to Daydream, they all need to overcome the chicken and egg problem between content and hardware. And obviously you guys invest significantly, which everyone in the production side is very thankful for. But Griffin, you said something earlier when asked why you're doing this was CEO driven. You're a business, you need to make money, obviously. What else? What would it take from the market for you to invest even more aggressively into comedy and VR at that intersection?
Much like, I'll give you a pretty simple answer. Much like Hulu was driven on maintaining subscribers or attaining subscribers, VR is going to be the same way. It's going to be, are we going to attain audience or are we going to maintain audience? And it comes down to how much time and money are you going to put into it. And on our side, as we're trying to shift a format, it's going to be stepping out and giving somebody, whether it be a writer or a comedian, and many of our comedians are their own writers, the opportunity to look at the format and compensate them in such a manner that they can invest the time into it rather than invest the time into what they're doing for Comedy Central or Showtime or HBO. Right now, on the CEO side, we're trying to bridge that gap by just filming it, but we're not necessarily developing it. In the event that we make that shift to developing it, we have to, literally there has to be the right amount of time and the right amount of money behind it.
And that predicates distribution and scale of audience, right? Which
Right.
we're not seeing really. I think the whole experience at South by Southwest this year is really one where VR in particular is almost seen as having gone through a hype cycle and being now at this trough of disillusionment a little bit. When you look at the number of headsets sold, etc., it's been disappointing. So. In the absence of massive audience scale, how do we move this forward?
Oh, well, then and this is what's great about being somebody that makes 65 to 70 stand-ups a year, is that we just have to find the right person where it's their passion project.
Yeah.
Right? So there's going to be one of those comedians, and they're going to say, I am tech forward, or I'm geek forward, or I love this technology, or I sit in the gaming world, or I already use the technology, and I'm going to do something very special for this. And they're going to break the format, right? Our format is 60 minutes of stand-up. They're going to break it down into smaller sections where they're going to take something that is normally an on-stage indoor piece, and they're going to take it outstage and outside, and they're going to interact in such a manner where the narrative is helped by being in a park or being at a playground or being at a sporting event or something of that nature.
So, as you look across all the content that's being created out there, what, in your personal experience, are some of the most hilarious, jaw-dropping, and fun experiences at that intersection of comedy and VR that have been created, other than what you've done yourself over years? What have you seen, Cy, for example, out there that has really had you sit on your butt and laugh madly?
Well, clearly I'm a huge Justin Roiland fan, and so Accounting Plus Plus was also quite hilarious. And again, Justin does a lot of comedy, clearly. And then in addition to that, he uses the VR, the interactive VR. He's a huge fan of VR, just passionate about it. Again, you're talking about comedians who are passionate about VR. He's definitely one of them. And so now he has his game, Squanch Games, and Crows Made Accounting Plus, which was laugh out loud hilarious. And then there are other games that are doing satire, like American Dream was a hilarious premise, which is basically you have guns for hands and you start as a baby and you interact with everything using guns, and that's the whole game. And you get a job putting holes in donuts, and you do that by shooting the hole out of the donut, and it's satire on the American Dream. And then there are other experiences that for me had me laughing out loud. There's experience Chocolate. I don't know if anyone's played it. It was here last year.
The music.
The music thing. That was more. I don't know. If you think of humor as this gamut of from you have maybe dark humor to just pure unadulterated joy. Chocolate's really on the joy end of the spectrum, and it had me laughing and just totally in tears, happy and laughing at this experience. So there are some experiences out there. They're quite fun.
Neil, seen anything that
I'd
has
say
you laughing out loud?
On the VR video side, there's probably less than on the gaming side, but two of the things that I really liked are, one I mentioned earlier, I Love Dogs, which is Wes Anderson. Its tone is very Wes Anderson, so it's not jokey, laugh out loud, but it's just subtle, and his tone is perfectly encapsulated there, and so that was really cool. And then It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia guys actually did a short version of their show, incorporating the viewer as kind of a character in it. And there were a lot of really funny Easter egg moments where if you look around, you'll see Danny DeVito doing something a little inappropriate that you may not catch upon first viewing, and that was really good.
Nothing to do with you being from Philly, of course. Right?
That's important. Go Eagles.
So we're obviously in the very first part of the first inning of the VR AR industry development. If you look out 10 years from now, What's your prediction and what this industry will be like and what role comedy will play in it? And not just in VR, but also in augmented reality. What excites you? What frightens you there?
Well, it definitely is the beginning, and I'm sure people are tired of hearing that, but it's the truth. I think we look at it more as like immersive computing, right? And it's the spectrum across augmented reality and virtual reality. And obviously, the rise of augmented reality has been pretty phenomenal with both ARKit and ARCore launching. So now there's hundreds of millions of phones that have augmented capabilities, and so I'm very interested to see where storytelling goes with AR. So like tabletop narratives that play out. I think there's a lot of like a rich canvas to play with there, and then scale also. You have the scale immediately because it's already on all these phones, and then eventually that'll become glasses, and so you can see, the world becomes the medium. Which is really cool. And then in terms of VR, I think that the technology is just going to, get more immersive, more crisp. Eventually, there will be VR video that is, light field, which will enable you to actually feel like you're genuinely in the scene and walk around and see. And then I think, there's no telling of where it could go. But really exciting stuff.
Mm-hmm. So 10 years from now, you're still producing VR comedy games?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do VR comedy for as long as they let me do VR comedy. That's the best part. Bring joy and laughter to people. Yes, I would like to do that. 10 years is hard. That's a really long time, especially in terms of the technology that we're looking at now. Like just how much it's going to advance in 10 years. I can't make any I would not feel comfortable making any prediction whatsoever because I don't like being wrong, and so I'd hate to say something and then be wrong. So I will say nothing. I'm really excited to see again. I think VR has the capability. We talk about VR as an empathy machine, and I have feelings about that. But what VR does do is that it sort of invites the person to have this very personal experience, and that allows people to have the gamut of experiences and feelings, and laughter and joy tends to be one of our favorites as humans. So I mean, yes, there's going to be humor in VR and experiences of joy and laughter and comedy.
Mm. And Griffin, in your business, I know 10 years is a long time, but
Sure.
You think VR and augmented reality as well will play a role 10 years from now?
I think that VR and augmented reality will actually be the norm within 10 years. I'm an old man, and I went from the launch of DVD in 1998 to 1998 to the crash of DVD to AVOD being usurped by SVOD, and that's all happened in about that time frame. To that end, the way I'm looking at what might be the next AR VR is how are they going to incorporate some of the other senses? Are you going to sit will there be a pod in your house where now that they pump in smells or breezes so that you think that you have another feeling or another piece that you're somewhere else? I think it will become the norm in some way.
So this will be the new frontier of fart jokes then?
Absolutely. I'm sure that there's some sort of chemical mix that will make it smell just like
Yeah. Well, we have a massive audience here, obviously, that is dying to ask questions, and I want to make sure we leave some time for that. So if you would please make your way to the mic, and Eric, you go first. You were there first. You get the first question.
Yeah? Okay, great.
There we are.
So thanks for coming, guys, to talk about this. It's so great to be an end cap to the show with the possibility of laughing our way home. And so it's an interesting question, about what's in 10 years, because when I look back, 25 years ago, before South by Interactive, when it was called South by Multimedia, and we were struggling with the same questions, right? And so there's a whole lot of artistic work and R&D work that we can stand on the shoulders of, but there are so many people that looking at the industry today as if this is the first wave of VR as opposed to the third wave of VR, right, where the technology is finally ready. And I think one of the key things that we should be leveraging that leads to my question, right, is that we know now that when people's bodies are engaged, that there's a greater sense of presence, which can bring out the empathy that you're looking for. And if we look at what makes people laugh in everyday life, beyond the scripted jokes is when things in the physical world don't go the way that you thought they were going to go. So I'm curious, and I think, Sa, you're probably the one to answer this, but maybe you guys, because I think looking beyond 360 video to where the world can be deformed, and objects can be deformed, and things don't function the way you want them to function, like what is your script writing team doing to change the ways in which the physical world in the virtual space doesn't act the way we'd expect it to be, so that we can get that kind of, that playful response?
I do. We do lots of this. This is actually a huge portion of our jokes. A lot of it starts off or comes from the fact that there's a lot of stuff in VR that you can't necessarily do. Like, for example, there's the age-old question of doors, right? You have a door in a game, well, it has to open. But in VR, you can't open it because you have this limited space, right, that can only walk within so much feet. So one of the jokes that we did in Rick and Morty Virtual Reality, sorry if I ruin this joke for you, but I'm going to. There's a door in Rick's garage. You go for the door handle and you pull it, and it has a joke which comes from the show where the doorknob comes out and on the side it says real fake doors, which is a joke from the actual show. So we joke our way actually out of a lot of these things where people will try and do something. The point for us in a lot of this is that you can't have something do nothing if somebody has an expectation and they reach for something. You have to put something there, even if it's subverting what their expectations are. And a lot of times that's where you can put jokes. That's where you can put the funny. I have another friend, another thing you experience a lot in VR is that players have agency, right? The people in VR have agency. We were talking earlier about how you can't direct them, right? You don't have the director's frame to move them around, right? Players have agency. They might turn around behind them. In my experience, they will put their face in the table. They will put their face in the table. They will put their face in the wall. They will put their face in any piece of geometry. They're like, oh, it's a real thing. You're like, oh, yeah, but I'm going to put my face in it. I have a friend who actually, in his experience, you put your face through the wall and there's like trippy colors and things. Like, you just have to put something there. But it gives and affords an opportunity to put like a joke to sort of invite them to play.
Yes, please.
Hi. So I'm unusual. My background's in improv theater, not like stand-up. Like, I've never done stand-up. I've done like so much improv theater. And so I've done like lots of comedy VR, but all in like live on-stage experiences where we bring an audience member onto the stage, we put them in a headset, we have things happen around them. And I've tried to make this in a scripted form, and it hasn't like landed just as well, or like where you create an app and you hand it off to people. But I took a couple notes as you were talking of stuff that might be inspirational. So Dimitri Martin had a sketch show where he would like literally sketch things on like a board while doing stand-up. And if you're immersed in a VR environment and you can create arbitrary objects around the player or have things change, that might be a really interesting point of inspiration. After Drew Carey did Whose Line, he did an improv show where they did in front of a green screen, and then later illustrators came in and drew what the result of an improv sketch was, and you could very easily do that in Tiltbrush or something. Also, if you've seen Mr. Show, they have really unusual relationships to space and time, and there's like potentially a lot of inspiring stuff there. So for the like VR, the live VR stuff I've done like a streaming show on Facebook Live. I did one at the San Francisco Fringe Festival. I did some sketch comedy in Sculptor VR, which has a multiplayer segment. So stuff that I like wrote down just now that I've discovered is funny is changes in scale or power dynamics. So making someone really big and really small. We've done things where we take one audience member, make them really small, another audience member, make them really big, and then have a performer narrate what their adventure is together. A misplaced sense of security or privacy. Distance with reality. So we had a bit where we put someone in a VR headset in front of a really fancy food table, and then we, like a really nice Thanksgiving feast, and we got an audience member to like feed them chicken McNuggets. And we're all like, hee hee hee, they don't know. Justifying the user's actions. So while watching someone doing something in VR, we'll have a performer kind of narrating to the audience, narrating to the rest of the audience their internal thoughts. VR is, so just, and also like VR is very grandiose. Like there's this, like the tone of VR right now, it's very like, let's drink the Kool-Aid and we're all gonna like approach the singularity as enhanced humans together. So like, it's super easy to make fun of VR because it takes itself so seriously, I find. So anything where you either take that too far or you just have things falling apart works super well.
Well, these are good examples, yeah. Good examples of devices, I guess. Was there a question you had, or?
No, I just was
okay.
Informational.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good thoughts, Sarvis.
Yeah,
I
good
think
thoughts.
like leveraging Tilt Brush to bring to life like the Dimitri Martin idea would be very cool.
Yeah.
Well, and I also really like the idea that you're taking comedy, but you are involving the audience themselves. Like again, this is like VR is so good for actually the person having a personal experience and interacting, right? And so by doing live VR and like involving them is sort of engaging with what VR is best at.
And there's probably some good like reaction videos that you can capture of the person in the VR having a strange reaction eating a chicken McNugget when they think it's a fillet.
And mismatching real reality with virtual reality, and it can create some really funny moments.
And I also like let's not take it too seriously.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, never.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we tend to take ourselves way too serious in VR. Yes.
Just going back to your sort of original question of why there is such a dearth of comedy in VR. So I've been looking at this for quite a while. I have a sort of clown theater background, so I've been doing a lot of comedy theater, and I'm a theater person, and I've been working on making theater in VR. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the people who have been creating in the VR space came in through cinema and TV, where you're dealing with, it's a time-based media, you're dealing with the ability, as you said, to really control the timing and the focus of what you present to the viewer, which, as we all know now, you can't do even in 360 video. It's really hard, and certainly in volumetric spatial experiences, it's really hard. So I think part of what I'm proposing is that really, to get more comedy content in VR, you really need to start looking at people who are making comedy in theatrical spaces, sketch comedy, or even, you know, people who are directing comedy plays and so forth, and bring that tool set into creating VR stuff. So again, sorry, I'm throwing ideas out as opposed to really asking a question, although I do have a question in that if, as such a creator, I've got some rough drafts or some pitches for some projects, how do I approach you guys about helping to bring those into reality?
Well, first of all, I think it's really, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting that the reference point that is more relevant for comedy and VR is more physical theater, less filmed entertainment and scripted entertainment. So I think that's a really, really good point of view. In terms of pitching ideas, I think we're all here, and everyone up here would be happy to take a look.
Yeah, I think you should probably come up to the table when we're done with the panel. And say, hey.
We'll have a bidding war for you and throw bags of money at you. Cool.
Shark Tank.
Yeah, that's right. Shark Tank for comedy VR.
It's like Shark Tank, but for VR. That's my pitch.
Yes, please.
Hello. So you talked about interacting with scripted content in a VR format. What about interacting, say, you turn old sitcoms into VR, and you inhabit a character, Jerry Seinfeld, for instance, and interact with pre-scripted characters?
I think it's very interesting. I think what Neil spoke about earlier in terms of augmented reality and the ability to put Jerry Seinfeld and his key characters in front of you on a tabletop and interact with them potentially is really interesting. I think there's lots of opportunities with volumetric video and with AI, and in combination of those two to create really interesting recycling for that type of IP that could be very entertaining and funny. That's just me, though.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's well said. I think it's, you know, those assets don't exist in 3D, obviously, right now, but eventually maybe some combination of AI plus volumetric can make that the reality.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions from the audience? Thank you for being here. Thank you for being so thoughtful. I know this was a very existential question to cover at the end of the interactive track of South by Southwest. So now we can go back to dealing with the lighter issues like trade policies and other matters and the revolving door at the White House. Thank you.